Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to come here to the Waitsfield United Church. My name is Joshua Schwartz. I'm Executive Director of the Mad River Valley Planning District, your three-town, Waitsfield, Warren, and Faison planning entity, also made up with representation from Sugarbush Ski Resort and the Mad River Valley Chamber of Commerce. This is the preliminary concept presentations on what's known as the VDAT project, the Vermont Downtown Assistance Team. Waitsfield was very fortunate to have this great opportunity. Waitsfield Village and Warren Village were two of 7 downtowns or villages in the state that are receiving this support on enhancing the vitality of our villages. This project was made possible through funding from Housing and Urban Development, the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, Disaster Recovery. I was like, is it relief or recovery? Recovery funding that made its way, and the Agency of Commerce and Community Development through the Vermont Downtown Program has been managing, and there was a selection of a group of consultants to do this type of work in 7 communities, and Waitsfield and Warren are 2 of them. And so there was a presentation earlier this morning in Warren, and this is the presentation here. This project has been going on for quite some time. That started back in the early part of the summer with an advisory committee that was providing some initial feedback to the consultants, and then they've been here in an intensive visit this week. From Monday all the way through till now, a meeting, having lots of roundtable discussions with different focus groups, a public input meeting this past Tuesday evening right here, and this is the culmination of a lot of that work. But it's not. It's the concept presentation, the preliminary side, and so there will be some additional work happening in November and December. But this has been the sort of the big muscle time of the work so far. But I'm really excited to have Tripp, who's been the lead consultant on the project, to lead us through some of the work he's done and also introduce the rest of the team. Thank you, Tripp.
Thank you, Joshua. It's a real pleasure to be here. The column's in the way again. We can't thank enough the Agency of Commerce and Community Development for giving us a chance to work with you all. I think everyone who we've worked with knows how very much we wanted to work here in Vermont. I've been working here for almost 10 years now in a whole variety of communities, and having worked in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi after Katrina, we certainly understand what communities go through after a natural disaster and the kind of needs and recovery that present special challenges. So thank you to our bosses, Leanne and Richard, for helping to coordinate this. And Joshua, thank you from the planning district standpoint on helping to organize this week. It's been fantastic. I'm going to introduce our team. We have great folks working with us. They come from all over the place. Laz Skangas and Heather Fontaine with Arnold and Skangas. They're based in St. Albans, and they're architects and extremely talented at what they do. Tom McGilloway and Nate Scott from Mahan Reichel Associates out of Baltimore, Maryland, worked on several projects with us here in Vermont over the years, and I've been working with Tom for almost 20 years on projects across the United States. And then Randy Wilson with Community Design Solutions. Randy is the Main Street architect for the states of South Carolina and Mississippi, and does great. You'll see some of his photo rendering work today. And then we have a couple folks who've gone back down to the south. That's Stephanie Francis and Stacy Pear. They're from the Gulf Coast and have firsthand experience dealing with FEMA, disaster recovery money, and working through community revitalization, dealing with those funds. Their main concentration is on implementation, and they'll be back for some of the follow-up meetings that we have. To echo what Joshua said, this is a preliminary presentation, and part of this is to test the waters with you with some of the ideas that we're coming up with. And I want to thank you for the incredible input that you gave the other night. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience from the other night, and it was a dynamic meeting. and getting your feedback was incredibly important to what we have to share with you today. I'm going to start out with the less exciting stuff, but to me it's real exciting, and that's the market assessment data. I think part of our philosophy is anything that we recommend really needs to be grounded in some market reality and understanding what the true potential and capabilities are of the community to be able to support the recommendations that we're making. We do this in a really grassroots way. We work with merchants to track customer zip codes. At our upcoming visit, we'll be delivering individual zip code survey results to the merchants who participated. You all conducted that survey Columbus Day week, and so we recognize what an unusual week that is because it is a very peak tourist time here. And so through this week, we've really come to the conclusion, as the last bullet point here, that we want to do another one that's at an off-peak time before ski season kicks off, just to have a comparative analysis of what's going on. But I will tell you, there are a couple of surprises, even in this peak series, that I think might even catch you off guard. It certainly caught me off guard when I saw it. There were a lot of things that were affirming as well. We had 18 participants. There were 4 in Warren and 14 in Waitsfield. The little asterisk by the one in Warren is that the Warren store has 2 parts. They did it, and the Pitcher Inn had their pub and restaurant do it. And so we had over 1,400 customer visits collected. The customers represented 685 unique American zip codes that passed through this community, these 2 communities in a 1-week period. 45 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, 10 foreign countries were represented. So you're doing a phenomenal job of pulling people in. And again, as I said before, we're going to do a second survey to look at it in a less peak season time to understand, because your seasonality is such a unique piece of this. We've done this kind of work. Well, I want to talk about that in a minute. The non-local visitor traffic, that's a real piece that we wanted to look at, and this is one that sort of caught me off guard, is that in spite of the incredible visitor traffic, the non-local Vermonter represented 29% of the traffic that came through all the stores during the week. It points to a very important strategy that, and by non-local Vermonter, I mean those that do not have a Warren, Waitsfield, or adjacent zip code recorded. And so they could still be fairly close. It could be Barry or Montpelier, but it's not those immediately adjacent ones.
Was a Waitsfield zip code that was noted in Warren considered non-local?
No, we're combining the 2.
Okay.
Yes, and for the market functionality on this one, think of this as both zip codes combined. I'm going to, as we do the future study, I'm going to separate them out as well. But you function as one market, but the uses get allocated sort of different. I mean, as you know, those that live in Warren have to come here to get some of their groceries. They can't get it all at the Warren store. Well, maybe they can, but. And so the non-local Vermonter was 29% of the traffic. As you would expect, Massachusetts represented the biggest jump with about 1 in every 5 customers. Connecticut was about 5%. New York, another 10%. And so you see sort of the local states here really represent a good chunk of that overall market, about 66% of the traffic from them. Interestingly, I want to make sure I get this right, the West was 11% of the traffic, and then we had 8% from the South, 6% from the Midwest, another 6% from the rest of the Northeast. Of course, by the time we've carved Massachusetts out, we've got New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Maine left. So New York and Connecticut are out. And then 5%, we have Mid-Atlantic, which is New York. And then I need to have this pie chart have another slot in it. There's a 5% slot that's from foreign countries as well. So really interesting data related to that. And as we've worked on these things in communities across the country, we see this unusual pattern emerging. You all ranked 5th in all the 200 communities we've ever worked in and the number of zip codes that you had come through in a 1-week period. The green that you see here, the second highest we ever had was Church Street Marketplace in Burlington. The highest we ever had was Waitsfield, North Carolina, which is a very visitor-oriented community. And yeah, so you probably know the traffic there in Waynesville. Below you is we did it 2 times in Church Street Marketplace as well. And so you're notching in between Burlington at a more peak time and Burlington at a less peak time. And so it's really interesting to see that data bear out and just realize that you're a market that has broad-based appeal and has an international destination cachet to you. When we look at the number of states, again, the only community I've ever had get all 50 was Burlington. You were tied with Hendersonville, North Carolina at 46 states. Actually, a community we worked in Mississippi had 48. And I joke around about the 46 states because invariably I know exactly what states aren't there. It's those doggone Dakotans. We cannot pry them loose for some reason. And part of the reason, too, is I think there's so few of them, that when they leave the state actually knows they left. So, and so having 46 is commendable. If you add back in D.C., Puerto Rico, and the 10 countries, it goes on back up to a significantly high number. Sort of neat information to see. At the end of the day, though, what we really want to look at is what the local market looks like. And again, please think of this. This is the 2 zip codes, Warren and Waitsfield. Again, they're going to function interactively in some ways, and then the uses, as we look at potential uses, will certainly allocate more opportunity here to Waitsfield than we would in a small village like Warren. But the 2 zip codes, the estimated population in 2013 is 4,358. And I know that may be a strange number to you because you often don't think of zip code populations. So that's the number that we're getting. One of the things that's important about the 2 zip codes, and bear in mind too, Faison gets included in those 2 zip codes, is that this is a growth market. And in our experience here in Vermont, that is bucking the trend. I mean, when I work in Springfield, we're in a declining market. In Rutland, it's a flatline market. In Brattleboro, it's a flatline market. In Wilmington, it's flat. When we worked in Waterbury, it's increasing. Barry is flat. So, I mean, you can just run through the communities and see. So the fact that you're growing is an important consideration as we look at things, because population growth is essential to sustainability as far as growth in your market and in opportunities.
Sure,
Yes.
I just want to clarify to make sure, I'm sure you know this because you're the numbers guy. Faison from Center Faison South is the Waitsfield zip code, but from Center Faison North is Moortown.
Okay, well, so we're getting part of Faison and not all of it.
Right.
And there's all kinds of, good funky stuff that happens with zip codes and identity. But for these purposes, I'm not counting the Moortown zip code portion. I'm counting the portion that's here. Thanks, Susan. The median age in the 2 zip codes is 46. So it is older than the state of Vermont at about 42, and it's definitely older than the United States at 37. Vermont's the second oldest state in the Union. Maine is the oldest. And certainly that does represent a particular, unique position that you have to deal with here. But you also have some really interesting things happening that buck some of these trends too. Median age means that half the people are over 46 and half are under 46. The median income here is $67,783, significantly higher than the state of Vermont in the United States. That was very interesting for me to see because when you have a high median age, you tend to have a community that has a lot of retirees that their income is not often indicative or reflected in the census data that we're looking at. In this case, it certainly is showing up as folks who are high earners in the area. And so that represents a really important piece of this. 30% are married couples with children. And so even though you have a higher age, you have 1 in every 3, that is showing up as married couples with children, or a little bit less than that. And so that's a great opportunity. And it'd be interesting to understand a little bit more about who are the ones that are growing, constituting the growth in the community. I don't think it should come as a surprise to you that 23% of those employed in these 2 zip codes are self-employed. They work for themselves. and about 1 in every 10 works from home. And so it definitely points to a strategy here. It definitely points to some of what we heard you say. It is a lifestyle decision to move to the Mad River Valley and to work in Waitsfield and to live here. And many people, 23%, are working for themselves, 1 in every 4. So
what's that national number?
that national number, I have to get it for you because I don't want to misquote it, but it's higher than national. And so I'll get it and I'll follow up so you can see the comparison. I'm not used to seeing it anywhere close to this high. But I wouldn't want to misquote. And so some very interesting things here. There is a percentage of the market that is below certain income levels. It represents about 17% that earns under $35,000 a year. And so while there's affluence and there's those that are well off, there's certainly those that are economically challenged as well. And I'll talk a little bit about how that works here. This slide's got some tiny type. When I put this on the top, I always say it's not how many psychos are in the community. This is this wheel sort of gives you a good explanation as I talk you through it of wealth and life stage. And so those in the green tend to be younger in years, and I say tend to be. You have this category called midlife success, and that age range actually runs from young 20s on up to the 50s, so it's a pretty broad. That's your biggest category here, and these are folks who are secure and successful. They're doing well. They're making a good living. The young achievers are those that are working toward that, but they're not quite there. They typically don't have children in the home yet. They may be married, but they're sort of working to get to the point where they become that success level, but they're not quite there. And then you see what we call the striving singles at 6%. And these folks, this is all done by Nielsen, by the way, the folks, the television. They take an aggregate of demographics, income, purchasing, trends on cars, magazine subscriptions, what they watch on TV, how they buy things, and they put it all in this stew and they spit it out with a secret recipe that they don't tell me what it is. So I always look at this chart and I have a little bit of fun as they sprinkle it with salt when you look at it. But the striving singles are those that, they're the ones that are struggling a bit. Now, we worked in State College this past summer. Now, in a university community, striving singles are a huge proportion of the local population base, but we know they're not striving in the same way they might be here because mom and dad are, lining their pockets a little bit. This is more of that middle age with kids or multiple kids in the home. Accumulated wealth is one of the wealthiest categories. You have what's called young accumulators, that's 1%, this little sliver here. Mainstream families, I sort of talk about them like these are the, mom, dad, Subaru station wagon, soccer field practice, that's sort of that category. And then going back to where, some of this median age issue, affluent empty nests represent about 1 in every 5 here. And those are folks who are very well, they're very comfortable, they live well, they've made some deliberate decisions. Many affluent empty nesters are still in acquisition phase. They're populating and furnishing a second home, or they've relocated to a new home from their original home. It's a very interesting category, and we're going to see more and more of them as the baby boomers continue to become, empty nesters. And then the conservative classics, again, I hate these names, but that's what they are. 7%, I often joke around, these folks drive Beamers and Lexuses, and these guys drive Buicks. But, it's really sort of, they're doing fine. They're maybe not acquiring as much as those that are the affluent empty nesters. And then you have cautious couples and sustaining seniors. This is probably out of the wheel some of the most, the folks that we need to care for the most, if that makes sense, because these are folks that are living on a fixed income. They're not quite the same as a striving single whose future ahead may be really bright. At this point, they're in the twilight, they're sort of looking at They're on a very fixed income, have very limited opportunities. So how do we take care of them and make sure that they're able to age comfortably in the place where they live and not have to move out of a market that may have some different demographics than they have. And so it's interesting to see this. We can break it down multiple different ways and look at it all kinds of detail, but it does shed some light on sort of the composition of what the two zip codes look like. The next thing I'll show you, and it sort of goes back to the market wheel that I showed you of where the customers were coming, is the retail leakage data. Please bear in mind the charts you're about to see are bound to cross your eyes, so I'll walk you through them. I'm going to separate it out by multiple retail categories. When we look at market leakage, we are looking at the two zip codes, and we're looking at what people spend versus what stores sell. So if folks inside the two zip codes spend more than stores sell, you're leaking those dollars. That means you pack them up and you send them off to something else. And that happens typically in three different ways. It may be that you're leaking sales in women's clothing. If you're leaking sales in women's clothing, that means that you might be buying them in a department store, which doesn't fall under the women's clothing category. It might be that you're ordering it from a catalog, which doesn't fall in the women's clothing category. Or it might be that you're, leaving this market to buy them somewhere else. And so, or you're trading it and buying it at, say, a general store or some other store that's classification may be different. There are also markets that are gain markets, where stores sell more than consumers can spend. And those typically are markets that depend on visitors for their sustainability. And I think there's a lot of aspiration here, and it's important to continue to work toward being a self-sustaining community. But the data really does point to the visitor traffic is absolutely imperative for the success of the Mad River Valley. Without the visitor traffic here, you would not have the restaurants, dining, and opportunities to shop and do the things that you want to do. This is a visitor-oriented community. Again, prepared to be boggled by the numbers here. So this is spending in the two zip codes, $85 million. And for those of you who were in the retail meeting yesterday, I've refined this from a drive time study to a zip code study, so my numbers are a little different. What I found in the drive time study is I was pulling Waterbury in, and it really skewed my data out of whack some. So consumers are spending $85 million in the two zip codes. Stores are selling $126 million. You import $41 million every year. So of your sales here, about a third of the sales are coming from inside from outside of the area. But that's conservative because that's assuming that all these expenditures are happening right here. And we know that's not true. And so we know that you're going, and I forgive you, to Williston every once in a while. We know that you might do some shopping in Boston. We know that you might be buying off the catalog every once in a while because they're just simply some categories that don't supply everybody's needs here. And so that even a third of this coming in is probably more like a half of that's coming in from outside. You'll see some clear categories where you are exporting your dollars, like when you want to buy a car. The Ford dealership, the Chevrolet Jeep dealership are not in these two zip codes. So, yes, sir.
Does catalog include online?
Catalog would include online, an online trade. And so, yes, you trade that for online. So, one of the interesting things, furniture, again, you're about break even, not a lot of money here, but you're leaking dollars there, but you're importing dollars in home furnishings. Makes perfect sense when you think that the visitor who's coming here is not likely to drive back to Massachusetts with a sofa in the back of their car, but they might drive back to Massachusetts with some accent pillows and some art in the back of their car. So, yes, ma'am.
Where did these data come from?
Very good comment. This is the expenditure data comes from a combination of the American Consumer Expenditure Survey and the sales data. That's really the main source for it. The sales data is a hybrid of sales tax reporting that they glean from the state level and from the Census of Retail Trade. And so again, I'm using Nielsen data to pull it down. There's two main companies that generate the data. And I appreciate the question because I want to also add to this. Please don't look at these as the gospel. Any market analyst who tells you that this is the gospel is lying through their teeth. There's a little bit of voodoo to this too. And so take it with the grain of salt that it is appropriate. But in order of magnitude, it's giving us a pretty good perspective. As we get down into the lower, very fine grain categories, it gets less accurate. So, again, you know, with certain things you're doing, like building material, you're actually selling more than people are spending. And again, this is a great case in point. Sometimes the wholesale trade gets mixed in with the retail trade on some of that. Food and beverage sales, your supply, you're actually importing dollars. So your grocery stores and supermarkets, you have 3 here. And really, your market would say 3's probably more than the locals could really support. And so the visitors are helping to round out that market a bit for you. When we look at things like pharmacies, you're sort of at equilibrium. We look at clothing, you leak dollars significantly in many of the categories. There's certain categories where you do somewhat break even. And again, when I get into some of these fine grain categories, we have to be really careful. And what I found too is that this is 2013 data, and they're still tweaking some of this. So I'm going to be working through it. The 2014 data got released this week. And so as we do the second round of study, I'm going to be using some of that data, and I may be backtracking on some of these numbers. Sporting goods, as you would expect, you're selling a lot more than people here would buy. Of course, that makes sense with the kind of community you are, being appealing to folks that are into the outdoors. We look at things like general merchandise. This is a red flag category for me. You're leaking about $10 million in general merchandise. I will tell you what this means. $10 million is about what the Dollar Generals and Family Dollars of the world are looking at, and they are sniffing around Vermont for markets that have this kind of leakage because they see an opportunity to come in. It's important that you understand this because I know there may be a visceral sort of reaction to, oh my goodness, here they come with their tacky yellow sign and everything else. And so I say this so you understand that may be something on the horizon. The community may need to think about, does it have the zoning protections to be able to have it come in with the kind of community character that you want, or may even think of creative ways to work through this, that you solve this and fill this gap in another manner. I will tell you also, though, don't be afraid of the big bad wolf, Walmart, and it isn't enough for them. And so they're not anywhere on the horizon anytime soon. But I definitely see in this number right here potential for that dollar type store to be interested in this area to capitalize on it, because they're seeing a local market that's leaving to buy basic goods like, carpet for their bathroom or towels or, underwear. I mean, you name it, those kind of basic goods. When we get down into dining, as you might expect, you are doing well importing dollars in the full service dining categories, but you leak dollars in the limited service dining categories. Now, some of that's getting recategorized, like if we eat across the street, he's not counted, Troy's not counted as a dining establishment. He's going to be accounted as more of a convenience store or gas station with convenience store. So you get some of those classifications sort of happening where your quick bites are not happening at a drive-through, chain restaurant. They're happening at an independent merchant who's doing a cool job of catering to the local market. At the end of the day, I mean, it's like seeing through the tea leaves and what are the real opportunities here. You have a really great core here in the village of Waitsfield. And although you're importing dollars, I see an opportunity for you to continue to grow in critical mass and diversity. And part of the real signal for me that was positive on this was seeing that regional outside, the Vermonter that was coming in from the region into the area. and we can watch just how a community up the road like Waterbury has transformed in the last decade from, to become a dining mecca, so to speak, for folks. You could be some of a specialty shopping piece. Some of that could continue to emerge for you because you definitely have that recognition that's coming in where nearly a third of your customers at peak season are coming from other parts of Vermont. You are visitor dependent, and this relates to that, but visitor, I use the term loosely, don't ask the visitor from the region is an important visitor. And so it does point to a marketing strategy there. Again, be prepared from a zoning standpoint to deal with what a general merchandise chain store might do. You may already be addressing some of this. The whole idea of home-based businesses and the idea of an entrepreneurial landing pad would really be excellent for the community. So to what degree, knowing how many folks here are working for themselves, are you being accommodating for that lone wolf consultant who can live anywhere in the world but might need super high-speed internet access or might want an office one day a week? To what degree are you cultivating a home-based business to transform that business into a business that has an office location? And so it gives you a really neat idea and a positioning for Waitsfield in particular to say, hey, this is that place where we welcome you. There are already a lot of us here. I was working in Connecticut last week, and there was a women's entrepreneurial group in Sandy Hook. They had 300 women, and 60 of them were active at their meeting who were part of the women's entrepreneurial group there, and they were there to network amongst themselves, and well over half of those women were running businesses that were lone wolf or from the home businesses. And so just creating that infrastructure for them to be able to serve as a peer board and learn from one another was something that they felt like was a huge thing for them. And I haven't actually experienced a group that was as robust and program rich as this particular group was. And if for any of those interested, I'll put you in touch with them. And then I think there's opportunities to look at infill and mixed use housing, particularly to serve some of that senior population that may not be able, so that they can age in the community where they live, and maybe they don't want to mow the lawn anymore and they want to be closer to the services that are here. We see that as an opportunity looking ahead as well. Yes, sir.
How important, when you say Waterbury has become this food mecca, how important geographically is it to be close to 89 to reach those other, Vermonters, where we're more inland, it's more of a hike to get to us?
A great point, and I think Waterbury certainly capitalized on their 89 access to become some of that. Some of the data that we knew in Waterbury is we saw a tremendous amount of Montpelier residents, Berry residents, and Chittenden County residents that were coming to Waterbury to dine. But going back to the evidence in your survey work here, you're already capturing them anyway. We're really only talking about an extra 20 minutes. And so your critical mass here and marketing that for the Vermonter, I think, gives you an advantage. It's not maybe the same as it is in Waterbury, but I sure wouldn't let it handicap you. I wouldn't let it handcuff you from going that marketing angle, if that makes sense. So, other questions on the market? I can come back to these, but I know the design team's itching for me to sit down and shut up so they can talk about the exciting stuff. All this is being recorded, and then we'll also be doing a report for this later that includes all this data. And I really wanted to refine it once we get that second round of market data completed so we can get that good comparison done. So with that, if you have other questions, I'll be back up, but I want to turn it over to Tom to talk from here on some of the design physical recommendations.
Thanks, Tripp. And as Tripp mentioned the other night when we had our meeting, a lot of what we'll be talking about in terms of physical design is related to some projects that are already underway. We met with several property owners to understand what their plans are and help them work them through, whether it was a site planning effort or an architectural effort as well. So some of the things we want to talk about tonight is just the general character of Waitsfield, the Mad River Path, streetscapes, traffic calming, opportunity sites, and some facade enhancements. We'll be referring to this map throughout the presentation. The black outline is the village boundary. This is the school. the Flemmer Barnes site, Main Street, Old County Road, and Ridge Street, just for orientation. And we'll point out some of those other things as we go along. Actually, okay, we got the slide in a different place. I put that. We'll come back to that later. Waitsfield character. This is my first time in the community, and I agree with a lot of the comments that we heard here. The first one we heard a lot was comfortable and friendly character. It's not, everything's not polished and crisp. The sidewalks aren't new, comfy curb and gutter and like you'd find in a new suburb. It's a more friendly, casual look. But then some people did say, but things in some places are looking a little shabby. So we have some ideas to share on that. We heard comments, the bridge is our Statue of Liberty. It really is an icon that people come to visit. People are coming to visit, but then they might get back on the bus and leave. And so how do we get them to stay in the community? It has a very distinct rural character and a very contained development area. That when we talk about the Northern Gateway, it's a very distinct transition from rural and agricultural fields to the town, and you don't have the sprawl that a lot of communities have. And then obviously the river is a very important part of the community's character. And in addition to some things we observed, some things that really struck us is just the presence of stone, whether it's in, and we had some of these same observations in Warren, whether it's in nature, or the stone that you see in nature, the rock outcrop, but how stone is being used in building and development, the stone walls and some of the garden spaces and so forth. And then some of the small details by property owners that are using. And just some shots of the stone that just really is, and sometimes you might take this for granted, but for us it really struck home. And just some beautiful details in the landscape. You have a big rock, you just build over it, and but we think as the reason we bring some of this stuff up is that as enhancements are made, whether it's streetscape, public spaces, or buildings, to continue building on this vernacular, these characteristics that are very unique to your community, and just some of the wonderful spaces, the fences, the garden spaces. And Barb and Sam's building, the wonderful gardens around their building. These really add a wonderful touch of character. Some places just some details of distinguishing a parking lot and giving that some definition, and some green space and some fencing and lighting to take the sting off of a simple parking area. And there's an opportunity to do that more. Wilmington, your neighbor down in southern Vermont, and Wilmington really does an outstanding job of this, whether it's from the town's efforts of keeping flower baskets planted, or individual property owners that just really go to town and they build off of they're encouraged by the town's effort and then do their own gardens. And it really, for a visitor standpoint, it really adds a great touch to the community. You have this going on now, but there's a real opportunity to continue that. Even something as mundane as a little planting strip, they look at it as a garden space. And as you continue some of your streetscape improvements and sidewalk improvements where you get little median areas, there may be opportunities to do some of this. This is Middleburg, Virginia, and Gloucester, Massachusetts. Again, very narrow strips, but property owners kind of turn them into something a little more unique. But it's not a fussy, manicured suburban treatment that you see. It really kind of reinforces the character of those places. Some exciting things, the Mad River Path, there's segments already in place, and then future extensions going on, and then opportunities to take advantage of some park space along that. This diagram, kind of an overall showing the dark red line is the sidewalk, the east side of Main Street. The Mad River Path comes along the old dam. And then there's plans to extend that path along the riverfront to a potential pocket park, back to the street along Main Street, and then around the elementary school, and then on an easement further to the north. The diagram I had in earlier with the big red arrow showed that there's a long-term potential in talking with the folks involved with the path to find a connection, a loop connection back tie into the polo field and back into Main Street on the west side. So there's some real opportunities to really capitalize on this, especially in the village core. And things like this, there's some plans for water access or access to the river further to the north, and there's opportunities to do that in the southern portion. So this is just zooming in on the northern portion. This is the Wait House, and then the trail comes along. The elementary school, I guess, is looking at acquiring some additional property. The trail will go through there, spur out to the road, and then working with easements along the rest of the river to go further to the north. And then at the southern end, this is Bridge Street and Main Street, the existing sidewalk. It goes along the dam here, and I'm not sure if I got this connection correct, but it ties back into Main Street, the sidewalk, and then there's potential along the river, and then especially to the pocket park that there's been discussion on right at the bridge. The pocket park is really a tremendous opportunity. We put forth a couple ideas for this, but we understand there's going to be a design study or competition or charrette in the near future, so we don't want to surpass kind of take away from those efforts. But a couple things that we think would be important. One is you just have this magnificent view looking down a long stretch of the river, so it really is a great opportunity to take advantage of that river view. It's a gateway to the village, but it's also a gateway to the bridge, and there's opportunity to take advantage of this grade change to as it sits down lower from the road, to take advantage of that grade change, maybe as an amphitheater. And just some thoughts we have. This is the bridge, and this is Sam and Barb's building here, and this is the corner, that there might be some terrace walls that step down to a lower area. There's perhaps maybe a boardwalk or a platform extension over that riprap, take advantage of those views to the north, incorporating stone, some of that great stone work we saw in the abutment to the bridge, and maybe along here, and then this could be a place for a kiosk, some interpretive signage, and so forth. Opportunities to introduce seasonal color and take advantage of those views. Again, we it's just some examples of some places. They could be steps, but they could be very done softly with lawn and other planting. They might be seat walls, that you might have 2 levels of seat walls that people can sit on there and look to the north. It might include granite steps with stone boulders in a creative way. And then this is in Wilmington's, right at their river, at the intersection of the bridge and the river, a new space that they put in, and again, using stone as a great place, stone and flower planting to complement that as part of the bridge. We heard a lot about streetscapes and traffic calming. The Bridge Street, there are some improvements being planned. Valerie shared the drawings with us for new paving, sidewalks, some conduit potentially going underneath the street. Some things that we think are important to consider along there are crosswalks, ornamental pedestrian lighting. We heard a lot from people about desire to have some lower scale, more ornamental lighting and scale with the street. Potential for conduit for future utility work there. We know there's some exploration of taking the overhead utility lines and putting them underground. What we understand, the difficulty with that is the pole that's near the bridge would still need to stay in place and get either bigger with guy wires and transformers. So what you gain by putting the utilities under Bridge Street may not get you anything if you still have to have that pole right at your most significant landmark, the bridge. So there may be opportunities to explore, are there other options or other routes for the utilities that you could look at. We can't get into that in this our 2 days of study, but we do think it's a good idea to at least get conduit under while the street's being built, build up conduit in place to accommodate, give you some flexibility in the future. We heard a lot about the desire for site furnishing, some benches, trash receptacles, bike racks, street trees on streets where V-Trans has their powers, like Main Street. Work with a lot of communities work with private property owners if the private property owner grants you an easement to put a tree in outside the street right away, that maybe the town or the village could provide that tree. And we'll talk about that a little more. And then Main Street improvements, again, crosswalk, sidewalk on the west side, and some ornamental lighting. And then we think it's important to balance the parallel parking and planting strips. So these are the primary areas looking at for the streetscape. Obviously you have the east side sidewalk already underway in Main Street. Some things that we, in looking in a more detailed plan, this is where we are right now, and this is the library, town hall, Bridge Street. So looking at crosswalks at the intersection, permanent crosswalks at the intersection, maybe enhanced. We heard a lot the other night, desire that parking lot's such a focal point. It's an important resource, but it's a focal point at your important intersection. What can we do right at the entrance to maybe enhance that? Maybe there's some electric charging stations incorporated in that lot. Ornamental light posts along Bridge Street and Main Street. Richard and Leanne with the stake can hopefully work with you and maybe getting an audience with V-Trans to work through some of their criteria as related to putting ornamental lights in the right-of-way, benches and bike racks, and planting areas in some areas like you did on the west side, doing curb extensions with some planting. But we think it's important to try to balance some parallel parking in there where the opportunities make sense. Street lights, a lantern, more of a lantern style like this versus an acorn style, could be appropriate. We're not going to recommend a specific one. We've been in communities that took them 8 years debating light fixtures, so hopefully that won't be the case here. But that seemed like it was appropriate. Oh, it sounds like I struck a nerve there. That's why we're not going to. And then this is a good example of trees that are outside the right-of-way. It is great to have trees within the green strip between the curb and the sidewalk, but if you get larger trees outside, they do still make a significant impact, and there may be opportunities along the way. We're working with private property owners to allow for a tree where you can't put one in the right-of-way. We'll let Randy talk.
Sure. I think everybody's familiar where we are in this particular scene. We're looking down 100 Bridge. And this, of course, in terms of physical location, I think you could probably argue fairly convincingly it's the heart and soul of your community. And just for the record, I love the person who did this.
Oh.
Because to me, what this person basically said is I just gave something away, but they took matters into their own hands and recognized this is a really, really important place in the life of your community. And it's absolutely critical that we get people across the street safely. As someone who took a lot of photographs on the street and took my life into my hands, and believe it or not, the day before when I took pictures versus after this, and when I walked in that crosswalk, the car stopped. It's amazing. But I think the other thing this person understood intuitively is besides safety, it's just a real important place, and we need to get people to slow down a bit to realize what an important juncture and decision pivot point, if you will, place in the life of your community. So basically what we're going to do in these next series of photo renderings is just illustrate photographically what Tom has already described and shown you in plan. So in the next view, with all due respect to the previous crosswalk job, we are going to make these a bit bolder just because, again, that visual element is a trigger for the motorist that I need to slow down. This is a place that requires safety. It's been my experience no matter where I travel in Vermont, if you just get within a couple of feet, the cars stop, okay, and they allow you to cross. And so that's a really great visual clue to slow down. As Tom alluded to, if you go back and then go forward, right over here, this loose edge that's beside the parking, go forward now. In this perspective, it's really important to maintain that edge. And by extending, however you want to call these, beside the parking spaces, then you start to sort of enclose that parking space. But I think it's equally important as you come up Bridge to the stop signs. Now your vista is terminated with these really rich plantings of trees as opposed to just looking into a parking lot. And then, of course, we have introduction over here of, if you will, in the future, the faux sort of gas lamps. And an indication, obviously there's a group who's done a lot of great work in working on branding and marketing for the community. And long term, it's going to be critically important to build on that work and introduce what we call wayfinding or directional signs, just giving the traveler visual clues about how to navigate the neighborhood, the community, to get to various key destinations. While we're at this particular rendering, let's go one more forward. We took advantage of taking a look at this corner building, which is really important, again, also in the life of the city. And regrettably, we didn't have a chance to meet with this owner, but we wanted to go ahead. Is that in a good way or a bad way?
It's really good.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, just cleaning it up fresh with the paint job. She's really excited. Number two, I love this gallery, and it's got the bright red door, and we thought if you just kind of get a splash of color by coordinating the canopy in that same color, it could really sort of demarcate arrival to that shop. You may want to consider long-term just what we call a wainscot, just to kind of ground this building into the earth, is going with sort of a neutral, sort of a charcoal gray color on the bottom floor. And again, I think it would almost sort of delineate this zone for the gallery versus the retail space that's accessed from
It looks straight now, the building.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Lastly,
Are you gonna cry too?
in conjunction with the plantings over here, obviously it's seasonal here, but the introduction, like Tom showed from Wilmington, whether it's flower baskets, boxes, hangers, or potted plants, any of those things could really help to enliven that intersection. So all the way before and after, go forward. These are your existing.
It's interesting, you haven't addressed the ballards around the water fountain, but it doesn't matter anymore. They don't stick out.
Well, yeah, a lot of times, sometimes if you try to hide something, you call more attention to it, but if you create something that takes your attention away from it,
Yes,
then you don't know. Talk about the bollards around them.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so we'll
Just keep going forward. So this is all the way back to the existing conditions, and then long-term proposed
Look at
conditions.
that, and it's really not even our time.
Next, do you want to introduce the gateways? You want me to agree? There's a cliche that says, you only get one chance to make a first impression. Well, that same sort of truism applies to communities. You really only get one chance to say welcome to Waitsfield. And I think with some of the mistakes that some communities make oftentimes is they associate that welcome sign or arrival only to their city limits. Now, mind you, the traveler doesn't really care where your city limit signs are. All the traveler knows is what they're experiencing. And so what we would encourage is this strategy pertaining to gateways. Whenever you feel like you've arrived to a different sort of space in the life of your community, you need to have some sort of announcement or welcoming gesture. And this, in our opinion, feels like one of those places in the life of your community. You've come from this sort of rural pastoral setting, and now everything's sort of pinched down with the landscaping, with the trees. And so in the next photo, we'll just go ahead and go forward. Some very simple strategies. A little bit of thinning over here to create some views, and then the plantings of some maples with lots of color oaks on left and right. We would strongly suggest, if you can, to relocate the sign that's currently back here and in certain angles concealed by the poles forward. And I realize that may be on private property. You may have to work out some arrangement. But we just feel like that's going to give a far greater sense of presence. Obviously, you can see we've already swapped out the signage. We'd heard some concerns that people felt like it was a little bit too contemporary. That's up for y'all to figure out. But this is dropping in the branding and the marketing work that the other group had already started. Tripp is going to talk in the next step slide about ongoing work that our team will help to kind of take those efforts and to support the work that you've already done.
Thanks, Ricky. The next series of slides, we want to talk a little bit about some key opportunity sites. And again, if we look at the map, we have the Flemmer Barns, the farm stand site that we know you've been looking at as a potential town hall, the former church site, and then what we're calling Cottage Crescent. Chris and Bridget looking at developing some additional cottages in that area that we think is a real exciting opportunity. So we get Tripp talk a little bit about some of these.
One of the things, I guess, architecturally, and we were hearing this from Laz and some of his team was that, no matter what happens to this building, it's always going to have a bit of a perception of being a church, because that's what it historically was. And unless you deconstruct some of those elements, it's going to continue to have it. One of the unique things about this is there's for private investment, there's potential for historic tax credits on the state and federal level for this building. And so that's ideally suited for private sector to take advantage of those things. Some of the things we explored, from basically looking at some of the market opportunities and some of the existing uses that were already in the community, we've worked in a tremendous amount of communities where private sector investors have taken facilities like this and turned them into for-profit meeting spaces, whether that's for wedding receptions or weddings themselves, for classes. Worked in one community where they basically use some of the common room where the dance class happens and the ballet happens and the jazzercise or Zumba or whatever it may be sort of occupies some of the larger space. We've also seen facilities like this work really well with private sector artist studios and gallery cooperatives. In my hometown, there's a gallery cooperative that has 16 studios and a common gallery on the ground floor. She didn't take a church, but she took a giant old warehouse, very flexible space, had a lot of big rooms, and she could do a lot of movable walls and adaptability in there. And then, of course, you could always even go for something like a restaurant or brew pub, knowing that beer culture here in the community is an important component of it, and one reason I love coming here so much. Sorry, editorial comment. But it was funny, I was showing folks a slide of a church in Pittsburgh that had been converted into a brew pub, and it had been deconsecrated, but the altar was where all the tanks were for the brewing. So you walk in and, it's, and really private sector investment here could contribute to the critical mass in the core of the village and begin to think about expanding that core. Go to the next one. With the Flimmer Barns, I'm going to say here, I am wading into dangerous waters, and so we know how much work has been put into discussing this facility and all the different things that have come up and the report that's come out. And all I want to say is that we tried to give it our thoughtful best and just throwing some ideas out for you to react and respond to, knowing that what the options we're throwing on the table is just one of many different things that you've already covered. So I'm treading very lightly in this discussion with a great deal of respect for the work that you've already put in. But what we were also trying to do during this discussion in our team is understand not just what it might be, but how do you pay for what it is you envision it to be by matching funding sources to the uses that might occur in this area. And so in a way we're trying to give a little bit to all the different thoughts that have been put in, because there's some real energy that comes if a lot of these things work together. So one idea we first thought about was the Central Vermont Community Land Trust being the owner. And it gives a different dynamic, because having the land trust be the owner, it takes the burden off of the town being the owner. And towns being the owner, is a challenging issue a lot of times, both from a political standpoint and just from an organizational standpoint. And so the land trust being the owner could give it a unique way to have an ownership structure that's still very much of the public interest, but also could accommodate a bunch of different uses. So that's just a concept. We're looking at possibly we're trying to identify funding sources that match what the funder is accustomed to funding. The Vermont Community Foundation, we thought, what if they funded a food and farm initiative, especially with all the things that are going on here, and it might include community agricultural space, a garden, it might include some, cooking classes or farm to table or some additional things. We know you already have the food hub here, so we're certainly not looking at recreating that. But giving a way perhaps for the visitor to interact with some of the things that are happening here beyond dining at a farm-to-table restaurant or buying from a store. And then looking at, there's a whole host of grant sources right now, in particular now, that are funding things for athletic and youth programming to keep kids active. And so having some sort of fields and activity space here, again, that wouldn't cannibalize the garden space. You have the garden and the field. And so the kids are perhaps even learning. Maybe they're doing some of the gardening and that part too. Because the land trust would own it, we are recommending senior housing be on a small portion of the property. And the reason we're recommending this is we've seen tremendous impacts in communities that have looked at where they have intergenerational relationships, where the seniors are located adjacent to the youth. And you have this mentorship that happens between those that are, grandmas and grandpas, or maybe they're not, and the young people that have youth programming nearby. And we're seeing that as a really neat opportunity in communities across the country. And so having a small portion of this be dedicated to senior housing, keeping them close to the center of the community where they can get to services and goods, would be a unique component of this. And also a way to sort of keep eyes on the facility from folks that are going to keep eyes on the facility. We're given the idea for the small barn to actually work through possibly the Vermont Arts Council for support in looking at renovating that space directly for an arts center and arts organization. So in much the same way the facility in downtown Barrie serves for classes and gallery space and other things, that this would be unlike a for-profit, gallery studio. This would be more of a non-profit gathering space and home base for all the artists and artisans that are in the community. We know what a critical part of that is, and this would help reinforce the private sector as well by sort of grounding it with a central space. And then there's the Vermont Barn Credit and the Historical Tax Credit that we could suggest for the larger barn. And the idea there is to renovate it to a degree it's usable, but maybe not fully weatherize it. So it could be used as indoor space in warmer weather months for gatherings and youth activities and programming and things like that, after school space. And then it could also be used in the evening for other kind of gatherings or events. And then the MetLife Foundation itself has got a very good grant for after-school innovation programs. And so if you can imagine, all this is really working together to serve the whole community, but at the core of what we're doing is we're giving the youth in the community a really neat after-school activity space where they can experience farm, they can experience art, they can experience recreation, and it's also appealing to the visitors as well. Again, we know we're treading into areas that you've all studied immensely. We just throw it out. We've got dollar amounts associated with each of these, knowing what the grantors are accustomed to granting. We are going to, certainly, we're deferential to all the work that's been done. All I want to say is we commend all the work that's been done. We're just trying to honor it and sort of show you how some of the pieces might fit together.
The other opportunity we've heard a lot about is the farm stand site, and we know you've been exploring a new town hall on this site. We're going to just comment that whatever happens on this site, whether it's a town hall or some other kind of development, that it's just very important to keep any kind of building oriented to the street, respect that street edge with any kind of parking located behind. We think there's a real opportunity to provide both a physical and visual connection to the polo fields behind, and give a connection to those fields to Main Street with whatever use happens here. So that will be important to consider. And then there's some fairly significant large shade trees on the site. It would be great to be able to work around them and preserve them in the development as well. With the other project that opportunity want to talk about is the Cottage Crescent down in the core of the village. And so we looked at a plan. We talked earlier about Bridge Street and the Pocket Park. This is along the river. This is the existing cottage, retail cottage, Bridget's cottage right here. And then this is showing how that concept can continue. We met with them, and they're very interested in exploring additional retail cottages, and this is showing how additional ones could be constructed, connected by a boardwalk system. That this ground is higher, so you could come in here at the level of the porches for ADA access, and then connect them along, and then they'd all be connected by steps down to the lower ground. There could be the ability to have some larger decks associated with some of them with outdoor dining. And then the arrangement of the buildings would really be dependent upon where you could work around significant trees, and if these would be nestled in amongst the trees. We heard a lot about a need for like a public restroom, and perhaps a structure can be developed somewhere in this area that serves some of the folks accessing the river. This is showing how the Mad River path can circulate through. Maybe there's some smaller offshoot trails that go through the trees and access some seating areas. And then also with the parking, we heard a lot about just cleaning up the parking a bit. There's something very nice about just the informal quality of that lot, but we think there's some things you could do with edging and planting to enhance that further. This is a lot. Some of these existing trees that are in the islands really help to break that up into smaller spaces and give more of a park-like setting. The gravel surface adds to that whole character of more of informal and informal environment. There are some areas, while we'd recommend keeping the taller trees in here, maybe some of the shrubbier vegetation could take out to open up views into and out of the space. We heard a lot about some activity that occurs down here that's not the most desirable, and so giving a little more visibility and natural surveillance could help keep the canopy trees but remove the stuff that's blocking eye levels. Outside of Bridget and Sam's store, we really like this detail that against the gravel lot, just that Belgian block or block edge, and that's maybe something that could be done along the edge of this parking just to clean it up but still keep that informal gravel character. And then maybe even incorporating some stormwater management, some rain gardens to capture some of the runoff, and then have some educational and interpretive elements along some of those pockets along the parking lot to really encourage some of those sustainable practices and education opportunities. If we go and look at start to talk in more detail about the cottage opportunities, we think something nestled in the trees here could really create something that complements, that is very unique, but then also complements the character of the downtown core, adds more positive activity and natural surveillance to this area, and then close to the river resource and that natural environment. It's just some example. This is Mount Gretna, Pennsylvania. It's an artist community, but houses built right in amongst the trees are just accessible by pathways, a very kind of wooded environment that's quite eclectic. This is Ocean Grove, New Jersey, with these tent structures in the winter. They're just a simple frame structure. In the summer, they're doubled in size with these tent structures, very colorful, and it creates this wonderful little artistic environment. Some examples from Oak Bluff, Massachusetts, and Round Lake, New York. Again, we have these clusters of cottages, very small scale, but very colorful and great character. And so there's a real opportunity. You already have this great character with Bridget's cottage, and then there's opportunity to build upon that. Let Randy talk a little more.
Yeah, so Bridget and Chris, I don't know if you had measured drawings of your building, but if not, Laz did you a favor and actually created these to scale for you. And we just wanted to make sure we understood that, because it has such a wonderful quality and sense of scale to it, and let that sort of be the prototypical size for any subsequent cottages. In the next, Laz basically developed 4 different models that might potentially be used on the site. The timber, of course, utilizes some heavy timber framing in the A-frame of sort of the projecting porch, transparent glass to allow a lot of natural light into the space. In each of these, you'll see some dashed elements where the space can either function as a one-story space. This is fun dodging this pole. Or if you want to have sort of a second floor loft, like in the case of Bridget's, that could occur in this manner, and you could tuck underneath there either a restroom or a storage space, something like that. This one, obviously, well named, is the Shingle Cottage, which kind of builds upon that whole sort of vernacular of the shingle architecture of this region. 2 additional ones is what he called the Gable Cottage, which really is most akin to yours, Bridget, featuring a dominant gable element. And then finally the tin roof that just kind of really builds up in that sort of small architecture, standing seam metal roof with a diamond window, again allowing lots of clear, natural light into the space, a large storefront window. And again, if you think about this in a raised platform boardwalk, all of these really start to make sense from an elevational point of view. We decided just to take a really quick view. This is the kind of existing conditions, and just, again, we're sort of limited by whatever cottage imagery we had, but just as to kind of give you a visual of how these cottages might nestle in there. Again, you know, this whole notion of this real sort of soft delineation between the parking circulation areas as well as the cottage areas, and again, the raised boardwalk. And by the way, part of that is it's a flood elevation issue that we had to raise any future construction in this area to that elevation.
How are you connecting that to Bridge Street? Just through the parking lot and then path?
To bridge, yeah, it would be to the parking lot, yes.
I think to the parking lot and the path. And the idea too would be to create almost like a circular shopping pattern so that folks don't reach a dead end and turn around and come back.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine folks walking down Bridge, turning down Route 100, strolling through past the cottages, coming out of the view at the bridge, and then coming up back up Bridge Street, or starting in any direction. But shoppers oftentimes want to not have to retrace their steps. They want to be able to sort of continue to find things around. And part of this too, the concept was to create more critical mass so that people would linger longer in the whole shopping district.
And unless you think this is pie in the sky, we have actually seen this happen. In a little town called Pascagoula, Mississippi, post-Katrina, we took some leftover Mississippi Katrina cottages and created, if you will, a retail incubator. And the advantage that these have, you know, imagine the reduced startup cost for somebody who wants to go in business when they're only having to support 500 square feet or 700 as opposed to a massive or a large-scale downtown building. It also just kind of creates some vibrancy, if you will, you know, Trip, in terms of the market. You know, sometimes every now and then you get that owner who has the big downtown building who thinks it's worth $1 million, you know, and it's hard to rent. But once you kind of free up some of the rental spaces by having people locate here, then people sort of get a better feel for the market dynamics.
The Anchor Square project we worked on in Pascagoula has 17 cottages, and it opened in 2011. They graduated 3 out of the cottages into on-street spaces, and there's a waiting list to get into the cottages. So you're creating this retail vibrancy basically to continue to reinforce vacant spaces throughout that community, and we envision that being very similar here based on the demographics that
You
you
could be
have.
artist studio.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it expands your retail space and offerings. And the other thing is, I think the thing that we underestimated in Pascagoula was that space like this one became its own space. I mean, they have whole pep rallies, they have, you know, festivals and events. And sort of this idea for retail incubation actually created its own sort of sense of place.
I just have a can you walk across the leach field? Like, could you put a boardwalk across the
Where's Leachfield?
Oh, it's, if you go back to the plan, it's got those.
There.
There.
Right there. This is a leach field. It's
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know the rate. I imagine you could. I mean, there's picnic tables set up there. I mean, I'm sure there could be a pathway or a boardwalk to one end. But we have, this is the pathway, the river trail that connects in. This is where, when I was talking about connecting the parking, this is where you have ADA accessibility. You may down at the other end have a ramp as well where the boardwalk switches back. But as Tripp was saying, you could really, you know, create a dynamic loop all the way through here.
Right.
All right, we're going to zoom fast up to the facade enhancements. We had the privilege of having a number of property owner meetings where, sorry, that's okay, owners gave us the privilege of hearing their ideas for their properties, and we had the privilege of responding with our own ideas as well. And so here are a couple of those. The first, and I'm sorry that Heather had the lead, but Heather met with the owners of this building, and historically, which of course, in my estimation, looks great as is, but historically it actually had a wraparound porch, and there was a desire to see what that might look like if that was reconstructed in the future. And so that's this iteration of the renderings to show that. And I think Heather did a great job with that. But there was also this desire, you've got this really wonderful sort of alley network, both here and the one closer to Bridge Street. And so to take advantage of the extension of this building to create sort of an outdoor space that would really animate or activate that particular alley with potentially outdoor dining and things like that. So once you become the microbrewery hub, there you go. And then of course, Tripp has already talked about some of the uses for the old church, and Heather took a stab at just showing, what a facelift might do, and especially now that it's not a church, some historical colors could breathe new life into an existing building, just draw out architectural details that have always been there, but you just kind of miss them when they're all painted the same color.
Yeah. We have people in this town who think everything should be white.
Right.
Everything should be
I've got a great quote from Thomas Jefferson about that if you want to see it. But, my opinion is life's too short to paint everything white. As pertains to the kayak shop, it was interesting when I pulled into town. My initial thought was, I don't know if you know the DeVoe paint color. They sort of use this sort of pattern as their brand. And so before I saw the sign, I assumed it was a hardware store. Okay. And then of course I realized later it was, and it was just a gesture to kind of bring attention, the vibrancy of the colors of the kayaks, et cetera, et cetera. And so the only recommendation we made for this owner and that Heather pulled off is, what if we took this pale blue, I don't know if you know, but this was actually their very, very original sign. But because of the tonal differences of two colors, it kind of gets lost. And so if we darkened the blue-gray to more of a charcoal, then that begins to stand out. And of course, and I think seasonally he does have the color out front with the kayaks, but just to kind of lend some significance to that original logo design system. Finally, had the privilege of working with Troy. Now, if Bridge and 100 is the physical center of town, this feels like the functional center of town. It seems like the whole universe revolves around this place. And of course, y'all are aware of just, all of the conversations they've been having, trying to figure out how can we get a sidewalk, how can we keep our sign, all that kind of stuff. So Troy kind of unpacked a stack that big of plans of various ideas that he had for this, and he's come up with some really creative ones, and he just asked us to illustrate his kind of most recent thinking, which I think has a lot of merit. And the first one is he wants to introduce a solar structure that would be in this area, and the solar structure itself would capture enough energy to run both the lights and the pumps in that area. Of course, one issue still remains, and that's the fact that his current sign still is in the zone where ideally we'd love to place sidewalks on the west side of 100 as well. And so what we're going to illustrate and encourage him is to go to the powers that be and say, hey, what if I'm willing to take the sign down if I can just simply attach some to the solar structure, and that way the sidewalk can come through. And to me, that seems like a pretty good, compromise, for lack of a better word, but a good solution that may have some traction. While we were there, we went ahead and showed, he added this sort of stoop element for weather purposes, but it really hasn't been finished out, and so we just showed what would happen if you went ahead and finished that out, introduced some of his current signage. So again, existing conditions and long-term proposed conditions.
You didn't paint that a different color?
How about this?
Yeah.
It's funny you should say that, because I talked to him about maybe this rust red becoming a pale green, and I think that's something that he would consider, especially since the wine shop adjacent to it also painted a tonal red. And so I think it would sort of lend, it would be kind of giving it that new fresh look. I think these colors are fine. It's just, but the green might be something good for a change. I just ran out of time, to be honest with you. So I think Tripp's going to say what's in store for you next.
Well, we've gone way over what we promised we said we would go, but I appreciate your patience. We have a follow-up visit in November where we want to talk about ongoing branding and marketing initiative for the village, as well as cooperative work among the various different partners, because there's a whole different layer of marketing branding that happens. There's the regional branding for the Mad River Valley, which is really designed to attract the visitor here. But then the Mad River Valley, once they're here, we want to disperse them to the different activities and events that are going on. And so certainly you have Sugarbush and Mad River Glen that are doing marketing, We also want the merchants to be able to be on that platter that's being served up of all the wonderful things that are happening in the community. And so we'll be doing a follow-up visit to work through some of those things. We certainly want to do refinement of plans, knowing that we landed in the community right on the eve of a referendum, which is never fun for the design team and probably not fun for the community either. And so we'll do refinement of the plans based on the outcomes of Tuesday's vote so that we can illustrate whatever those outcomes may be. And then we will be hoping that the businesses would agree to do a second zip code survey so we can compare data from peak season to a more off-season time of year. And then we'll be back in December to work through implementation strategies and then really fleshing out all the different funding options that are available to the community as well. So with that, I want to wrap it up and open it for questions. Thank you for being patient and listening to everything we had to present today. But thank you even more for the quality input that you gave through this process, because it was a tremendous help of all of us on the team to be here these past few days. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Questions for us? Or if we just sort of...
The septic design with the cottages in the back and where that would go and how it would.
Septic design? Yeah. No, we haven't done that yet, so that's going to be an issue. Yeah.
Tripp, I have a quick question. You said, if I remember correctly, it was approximately 50% of our retail or income is from the tourists. That was it came up to about half?
Right.
Non-local.
Right. About half.
What is the average in a resort area?
That's a great question.